Okay, so lecture 7 of the Introduction to Solid-State Physics. Last week, we spent a whole week studying one-dimensional models of solid, and we looked at two models. One was a model of vibrational modes in a one-dimensional chain, and we introduced phonons by quantizing those vibrational modes. And the second one was a tight binding model, where electrons, rather than vibrations, were considered, and electrons were allowed to hop from one side of a one-dimensional chain to the next. And these two models allowed us to introduce a lot of fundamental concepts that we encounter in sort of big world solid-state physics, the real solid-state physics, band structures, dispersion relations, and so on. But now we are going to get more serious with solid-state physics, and I told you before that a major role is, of course, played by the specific arrangement of atoms in each solid, and that is called crystal structure. So today we are going to start incorporating crystal structure. However, it will not be a lecture like we had before, where we would add a new element and then immediately see how our understanding of solids enhances. Okay? Unfortunately, it will be 1 or 2 lectures of a lot of definitions, and I'm sorry, but every person who studies solid-state physics has to suffer through this. There is a lot of nomenclature related to crystal lattices and things like that. And we will be going through that, but I promise you that eventually we will go back and see how all of that we learn now becomes relevant in better estimating the band structure for each material and figuring out whether this particular material is an insulator or a dielectric or a semiconductor, and all these important things that gives meaning to the studies of solid-state physics. So crystal structure, crystal studies is a huge area of research on its own, and many textbooks are written just about that. Old-style textbooks begin by introducing this and then go to more interesting things like solid-state physics. And this is why I like your textbook, that it starts with some toy models and some initial experiments and some simple concepts, and then introduces this crystal stuff to you. So I think this is a more gentle and a more exciting way of doing this. 1 or 2 words about the variety of solid or condensed matter, just to place us correctly in what we are going to be studying. Here are various forms of condensed matter, and you know many of them already. The reason why they're all in the same slide is because it highlights the difference between them is in the amount of ordering or the amount of symmetry that these different classes of materials possess. And so we are actually going to be focused on crystals themselves. So just crystals without molecular crystals or quasi-crystals or liquid crystals. Just crystals are periodic arrangements of atoms, which can be characterized by a lattice. For example, this is the salt crystal. These are quartz crystals, the real pictures of them. And you can see that the crystal structure of these crystals manifests even on a macroscopic scale. And this is because these various planes that you see here, they are the cleave planes. So you try to grow a crystal, and it will form these planes. And these would be the natural planes where the atoms terminate in a nice way. For example, a plane like this one. Or if you break a crystal, it will tend to break along some kind of a special plane. And so the crystal structure, you can sometimes see it on a macroscopic scale in these big crystals. There are things with less order. For example, liquids are isotropic in any direction, unless we consider some special liquids, because the molecules can rotate freely and move around. So in principle, if you are in a liquid at some point and you are here in a liquid, your environment is not ordered, but similar. So there are models of liquid that treat them as just a medium, like space. So there's a different field of study for liquid. But for example, these molecular crystals or liquid crystals have partial order. These molecular crystals is a big molecules. For example, these are fullerene, I believe. And they're held together by some forces, or maybe van der Waals forces. There is some freedom to make a lot of defects in how the fullerenes are arranged. But even if not, each of the sides of this crystal has 60 molecules. We're not going to study such complicated things. These liquid crystals, this is what we have in the LED screens, for example. They are elongated molecules that also arrange themselves in chains like this. So there is partial ordering. So they are chaotically located inside each chain, but then there is a periodic structure of chains, for example. So there is an ordering in one direction, but not in the other. So this is a partially ordered system. Amorphous materials are solid, but they are a bit like liquids. So the atoms are fixed in their positions, but they have chaotic distributions of atoms, and therefore distances between them. And so this is a fascinating field of study. We're not going to deal with that. And down here we have 2 interesting examples. So of course, a very important one, polymers. That's a biological physics and polymer physics itself, but special importance it has in biology. And these are structures that may have local order on the polymer. So there is a repeated monomer that just keeps going. However, overall, the shape of that molecule can be very flexible. And so there's no translational invariance here, unless you want to travel in a space which is just bending together with the molecule. So there are ways to describe that, and we're not going to study that. And who knows what this is? Penrose tile, that's right. And the Penrose tile is an example of what? quasi-crystal. That's right. So this is a very interesting, peculiar thing. Actually, there was a Nobel Prize for it, although Penrose didn't get it. An experimentalist got it. It is a pattern created of two shapes, the green shape and the blue shape, and they are stacked together to fill the entire space. This is why it's called a Penrose tile. Penrose came up with this tile that tiles up the entire space. However, it is not periodic. You may check this yourself. It may look periodic, like there are some patterns that look similar, but they're not quite similar. And even if you find ones that are exactly similar, you go by another period and there won't be the same one there. So this simple thing, two elements, but not a periodic structure. So this is not a crystal, this is a quasi-crystal, and we're not going to study those in here. So just the crystals. And this is how we will define crystals. Crystals are something that can be described by a crystalline lattice. And we will define lattice in a very simple mathematical way. A lattice is a set of points in space, and you should be able to get to one of these points to any other point by a combination of primitive lattice vectors. So these are just vectors in 2D or 3D, and any point on the lattice can be described by this formula in the red square. So every point of the lattice belongs to this family, and you can reach any point of the lattice by finding the proper coefficients n1, n2, and 3 for the three primitive lattice vectors. So here's an example of a collection of points that is a lattice. So here, this is a two-dimensional one, and so we have two primitive lattice vectors, a1 and a2, and we can get to any point on this plane by going over by a1 and by a2 a certain number of times. So for example, this point highlighted here, you have to go twice over by a1 and once by a2 to reach that point, and therefore sometimes this point can be notated with square brackets 2, 1. This crystallography business often refers to square brackets or just regular brackets for various crystalline notations to denote the sites that you want to go to, or planes or lines that cut through a bunch of points. So these kind of notations are frequent in crystallography. You may hear someone talking about the silicon 111 plane or gallium arsenide 001 going in the 001 direction, and that would be referring to the crystal structure. Okay. Now, here are a couple more examples, because you can have various lattices. As you know, this is a square arrangement of points. These are just 2D examples, but this is a hexagonal one. So for the hexagonal one, this angle between A1 and A2 is 120 degrees. It's called hexagonal, and can also be called triagonal. So you can check that in this case, as in this case, you can get to any lattice point by a combination of A1 and A2. It's straightforward for the case of a square lattice, but it is also the case here. So for example, you can reach this point by adding up these two vectors, so this would be 1. Okay, so a lattice is a collection of points, and it is defined by primitive lattice vectors. We will actually reserve the word basis for a moment. So just call them primitive lattice vectors. And this choice is not unique. So you can choose various combinations of lattice vectors. In fact, these 6 here are all primitive lattice vectors. You can check that you can get to any point on this lattice by a combination. So for some of these, it's more obvious than for the others. But for example, if we look at the bottom left, the bottom right one, it looks like this one here skips a lot of points, right? Reaches out to very far. But actually, you could get, for example, to this point here by taking a difference between the two vectors, right? Which will give you this kind of vector. So by playing with these combinations, linear combinations of lattice vectors, you could get to any point on this lattice. So the choice is not unique. However, to be primitive lattice vectors, they need to be able to give you access to any point on a lattice. And of course, some of them are more convenient than the others. You will probably not want to use these, but you might want to use these or these in certain situations, as we will see. Okay, so I borrowed this quiz from the author of the textbook, Professor Stephen Simon. I think it's a wonderful exercise. So the question is, here's a lattice, here are the two vectors. Are they primitive lattice vectors? Who can tell me? I can see I made one mistake compared to Professor Simon because he was offering chocolate. No, so they are primitive lattice vectors if you can get to any point by some linear combination of these two vectors. If you can cover this entire lattice and not miss any points, then these are primitive lattice vectors. So are they or not? I see some people nodding, 3 people nodding, 1 person Semi-nodding, 4 people nodding. Okay, well, it is correct. So they are primitive lattice vectors because this is what you can do with them. You can cover the entire plane this way, and this is all good. Now, how about these? I see some people saying no. Why? Why not? That's right. Absolutely correct. Actually, students at Oxford didn't get it. So hail to Pitt. So indeed, you cannot reach these points in here. Maybe I gave you too much setup for this question. You cannot reach these points in between by any combination of these vectors, as long as you allow only integer, right? As long as you allow integer coefficients for the vectors. However, if we had a lattice like this, these would be perfectly okay to be the primitive lattice vectors. Okay, so this is a bit of practice. We will be doing a lot of these kind of geometrical things today, thinking about different arrangements of points and so on. All right. That was the lattice. And now the next important point is a cell of a lattice. Right? So we call it a unit cell. It is a unit cell when you can cover the entire space. You can tile it, like in Penrose tile, right? But now in a periodic way. You can tile the entire space by reproducing this region of space, which is called a unit cell. So for example, in the picture here, you can convince yourself very easily that if I keep repeating this green shape, I will cover this plane without any gaps left. I will tile this plane up. Okay? So you can completely fill or tile all of space reconstructing the lattice. Furthermore, so this concept of a unit cell is already familiar to you from a one-dimensional chain, right? There we had a lattice constant, A, and we could define a cell, a unit cell, which we would repeat indefinitely to reproduce the chain. Now we are generalizing this into 2D and 3D. Okay, so very important, a primitive unit cell is the kind of cell that contains exactly one lattice point, right? So in general, you could include 10 lattice points and then repeat it many times to cover the entire space, and those would be unit cells. But a primitive unit cell is when it only includes one lattice point, like is shown in the picture here. And so then, by repeating the primitive unit cell, you will be able to cover the entire space using probably just the primitive lattice vectors. Okay. We will also sometimes use a conventional unit cell. Conventional one is sort of derived from convention, so common sense unit cell that is convenient. It could also be called a convenience unit cell. Something that it makes our calculations convenient or makes it very illustrative for us to see the inner workings of the lattice, but may include several of the points of the lattice. And in that case, it will not be a primitive unit cell, it would be a conventional unit cell. For a simple lattice, it's fairly easy to identify a primitive unit cell. Like if you look at this picture here, you can just tell that you draw some shape around one point, and for the right size of that shape, you can reproduce the entire plane. For more complicated lattices, it can become tricky, but there is a very easy algorithm for finding a primitive unit cell, which is called the Wigner-Seitz method, which I will show you in a moment. So for now, just remember, there is always a way to identify a primitive unit cell for any lattice, Okay, so much like primitive lattice vectors are not unique, you can see from this picture that the primitive unit cell is also not unique. Here, in particular, I am drawing a variety of shapes around lattice points, and so what this one illustrates to you is that the boundaries of a primitive unit cell can be quite diverse, depending on my purpose, perhaps, or the ability for how I can arrive to these boundaries. I am free to choose any of these, and all of these fit the definition of a primitive unit cell, because by translation, by primitive lattice vectors, I can tile the entire space regardless of what the boundaries look like. So this is all okay. These are all primitive unit cells. Now, remember I had a green shape around one of the points in this lattice. So what I did now is I just shifted it a bit, and I placed it in such a way that the lattice points are in the corners. And this is actually also a valid primitive unit cell. But it introduces another interesting concept of sharing lattice points between several of these unit cells. So in fact, what you would say for this case is that each of the points contributes 1/4 of a point to this unit cell. So the total number is then still 1 point, but you take 1/4 from this, 1/4 from this, 1/4 from this, 1/4 from this. Sometimes for mnemonic purposes, you can figure out what fraction of a point is contributed by drawing the rest of it and seeing that there are 4 quadrants of a single point. split, and the 1 point belongs to 4 different unit cells. In this case, you say that it contributes 1/4 of a point to each. So we will be counting the number of points per cell a few times today, and therefore this concept will come up. Okay, so they all add up to 1 point. We don't say that because this one has a larger angle, then it contributes more of a point and this contributes less of a point. No, just how many cells one lattice belongs to, and then just that's the fraction of a point that it contributes. This is also fine. This is also a good unit cell. In this case, we have 1/2 of a point here. We have 1/2 of a point here. The total is 1. So this is also called as a coordination number. On the contrary, this is not a unit cell, a primitive unit cell, sorry. So if we do this operation, calculate the coordination number here, we get 1 from this, and 4 times 1/4 for these 4 points. So while this will cover the entire space for this triangular lattice, the coordination number here is 2. So it's not a primitive unit cell, because for the primitive unit cell, it has to include 1. That's maybe split between 4 or so on. But
明天30了，后天31了。